complete attention, if you please.
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher. I just try everything I can think of.
Orson Welles, we can say for sure, changed the history of filmmaking. You know, film might not have been quite the same without him.
He was truly a genius, and he was a genius in every sense of that word. He was driven, maddening, impossibly brilliant.
A psychiatrist could explain it better.
He was a director who did things that nobody else had ever done. He was an actor who commanded the scene like nobody else. He was a complete maverick.
Sure, if you're so anxious for me to join the game, I'd be glad to.
He also had one of the most wonderful Orson voices on screen.
Today I feel disposed to be gregarious and communicative, and I believe you could amuse me.
Orson Welles was the greatest actor, director, writer, producer that the medium has ever produced.
George Orson Welles was born the 6th of May, 1915 in Kenosha, Wisconsin. His mother, Beatrice, was a concert pianist, and his father, Richard, was a businessman who was sadly also had alcohol troubles.
Wells was clearly a prodigy from an early age. I mean, he could read fluently at 2, and he was writing plays at 10. The real problem was that his parents separated and divorced when he was 4, and he sort of spent time with both of them, but I think he was probably close to his mother. And sadly, his mother died when he was 9. After her death, he went to live with his father and a family friend, a doctor called Morris Bernstein, who looked after him.
Well, when he was living with his father took him to Jamaica and to the Far East on work trips. So he'd been a widely traveled guy, even at that young age.
In 1926, Orson Welles was enrolled at the exclusive Todd Seminary for Boys in Illinois.
He took a leading role in the local dramatic society at school, and also in the local radio at school too.
Unfortunately, in 1930, Orson Welles' father also passed away.
After his father died and he inherited quite a lot of money, he was allowed to choose his guardian, and he chose family friend, Dr. Morris Bernstein, who had been great friends with the family and his father.
In 1931, Orson Welles actually turned down a scholarship offer from Harvard, and instead he studied painting for a while at the prestigious Art Institute of Chicago. But he had a sort of itchy feet and was ready to make his way to Europe.
He headed for Europe because I think he felt that Europe was the place that would feed his soul. And he ended up in Dublin, in Ireland, at the age of 16. And he walked into the Gate Theatre and basically lied his way into a job. I mean, he claimed that he was a very famous and celebrated young actor in a New York theatre. And although the artistic director of the Gate Theatre didn't actually believe him, he was so entranced by his chutzpah and his energy that he took him on.
Unfortunately, the Irish government didn't extend his visa, so he had to go. And he went off to London. Same thing happened there. They realized how very talented he was, but he wasn't allowed to extend his visa.
He went to New York, and he couldn't work there, so he just took off for Europe again and went to Spain and Morocco. He supported himself a lot of this time by actually writing. I mean, he wrote sort of columns for newspapers and things, so he was incredibly enterprising.
In 1933, Welles returned to the United States and at just 18 years old continued his acting journey.
Eventually he came back to Chicago, where he met Thornton Wilder, the playwright and writer, at a party. Wilder was entranced by the young Welles and introduced him to Alexander Woollcott, who was the critic and writer at the time. Woollcott then suggested that he be introduced to Catherine Cornell, who was about to start a traveling theatre.
He joined Catherine Cornell's touring company very successfully, performing in a range of productions from Romeo and Juliet to Candida. And eventually, they opened their Romeo and Juliet on Broadway. And Orson Welles was among that cast at just the age of 19, made his Broadway debut. Radio was absolutely booming in New York in the 1930s, so Orson Welles was working for several companies. He had his own Mercury Theater show, he was in The Shadow, he worked for CBS Radio. And quite funny that these studios, the radio studios, weren't all in the same building. He was having to cross Manhattan quite frequently. And somehow, he thought, waiting in taxis was not going to be fast enough. So somehow he convinced an off-duty ambulance to ferry him around from time to time. We don't know how this was legal, but Orson Welles always found a way.
On the stage, he produced a voodoo Macbeth, all-black cast, the first time it was ever done, which the critics thought was terrific. And of course, he did his great, amazing piece of work, which was the radio production of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
It was presented as if it was real news reporting from the scene of an alien invasion of New Jersey. And this sounds quite far-fetched today in the era of social media. You could check it on Twitter. But at the time, radio was the main device of communication, and people believed this. There was a real panic.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and this thing must be hollow. He's moving!
It was infamous. I'm pretty sure that it wasn't intended. I don't think Welles really intended to create a panic. What he intended to do was create something that just sounded realistic. But the outside of it all was that it made his name.
As a consequence, he was an instant celebrity. And Hollywood, already, hearing of his leaps and bounds in the world of theatre, suddenly really woke up to the idea of Orson Welles is important. We should bring him to the West Coast. It's time to strike a deal.
RKO Studios offered him a contract, the like of which had never been given to an untried filmmaker before. You have to remember that Welles was 24, and they offered him a contract which was pretty well allowed him to do anything he wanted. He had final cut. He was given an advance of around $200,000, which was completely unheard of, and he could choose his own subject. And finally, he came up with Citizen Kane.
There's never been a film debut quite like Citizen Kane, still regarded by many as the finest motion picture ever made, certainly by everybody who studies film as one of the most influential motion pictures ever made. Orson Welles co-wrote, directed, produced this film. It was totally his vision. Obviously, he's also starring in it as Charles Foster Kane.
Welles took the figure of a tycoon who was based on several people, not just William Randolph Hearst, and probably his own life, in as much as probably he took a little bit from his father as well. And he welded it together into this epic saga of aspiration and love and the fall from grace of a major player on the world stage.
I think I should remind you of a fact that you seem to have forgotten.
Yes.
That you are yourself one of the largest individual stockholders in the public transit company.
The trouble is you don't realize you're talking to two people. As Charles Foster Kane, who owns 82,364 shares of public transit preferred, you see, I do have a general idea of my holdings. I sympathize with you. Charles Foster Kane is a scoundrel. His paper should be run out of town. A committee should be formed to boycott him. You may, if you can form such a committee, put me down for a contribution of $1,000.
My time's
On the other hand, I am the publisher of the Inquirer. As such, it's my duty, and I'll let you in on a little secret. It's also my pleasure to see to it that decent, hard-working people in this community aren't robbed blind by a pack of money-mad pirates just because they haven't anybody to look after their interests.
He arrived with, again, no formal training and he had been given everything he wanted, complete creative freedom. And because he was a genius, he put that complete creative freedom to incredible narrative use. And he developed with the cinematographer Greg Toland deep focus, the idea, and it's a very kind of theatrical idea in a way, that your eye can gaze back and back and back into the frame and this detail would be seen.
The deep focus, the way things were edited, the sound design, all quite unique for the time and really groundbreaking, and such an auteur piece. This really was his vision.
He chose his cinematographers remarkably well. He always worked in black and white because he thought that was the right thing to do.
Now in complete control of the government of this state, I made no campaign promises, because until a few weeks ago, I had no hope of being elected. Now, however, I have something more than a hope. And Jim Geddes has something less than a chance.
Now, the problem with Kane when it came out was not that it wasn't hugely well received by the critics, but that it didn't make a huge amount of money. And the reason behind that was that William Randolph Hearst was so incensed at having people believe that it was about him that he tried to pressurize the studio into actually destroying the film.
He couldn't do that, but he could stop it from being advertised or reviewed in Hearst newspapers. Because Hearst was so powerful, because there was a Hearst newspaper in most major markets, of course him trying to block this film did have an impact on the initial box office success of the film.
Charlie, you got other things to think about. Your little boy. You don't want him to read about you in the papers.
There's only one person in the world to decide what I'm going to do, and that's me.
It still ended up with, I think, 7 Oscar nominations. There was still a part of Hollywood that recognized what it was. And of course, its legacy is undimmed to this day. I think the distinction with Citizen Kane is that it is the greatest American film ever made because it's the greatest film about America.
What do you mean, useful?
Something you'd use later in your business or profession.
I don't intend to go in any business or profession.
No?
No.
Why not?
Well, just look at them. It's a fine career for a man, isn't it? Lawyers, bankers, politicians. What do they ever get out of life, I'd like to know?
For his follow-up, The Magnificent Ambersons, RKO didn't really live up to that creative control that they had given him on Citizen Kane. Really dodgy, classic Hollywood screws the director story.
The Magnificent Ambersons was a big historical film. Very, very interesting subject about the fall of a grand family as a result of changing times.
It stars Joseph Cotton. Wells doesn't appear in it, he only narrates. It's a fabulous depiction, and it's beautifully shot, again, deep focus, this wonderful kind of sense of timelessness and a kind of dreamy, entranced way of depicting America.
Wells finished a rough cut that ran around 3 hours. He was then invited to go to Latin America to make a film for the government called It's All True. So he rather hurriedly went off to do that before finishing the final edit of Magnificent Ambersons. In between that time, because RKO had been so nervous about the contract, they had in fact renegotiated the contract with Wells, and he did not have final cut for Magnificent Ambersons.
When he returned, he found that RKO had more or less destroyed his film. They thought it was too depressing, the story of this family, and he was certainly very upset about it. He screamed and shouted, but nothing happened.
I'm not sure George is wrong about automobiles. With all their speed forward, they may be a step backward in civilization. It may be that they won't add to the beauty of the world or the life of men's souls. I'm not sure.
So they edited it behind his back, they reshot scenes, they gave it a happy ending, they did all kinds of things that he would never have allowed. And by the time he got back, he found a film that he didn't recognize. and he tried to disown it. It was released. It is still, what is left of it is still a wonderful film, but that pretty well sort of messed up his relationship with RKO, who then, of course, noised it abroad around Hollywood that he was incredibly difficult to work with and that he always ran over budget, and basically promulgated all the kind of stories that wrecked his career at that time in Hollywood.
Wells's troubled relationship with RKO continued during production on the 1943 spy thriller Journey into Fear.
Mr. Hardgraham, you are a careful driver and an imaginative pedestrian. You never ride horses nor climb mountains. You do not hunt big game. You've never felt the slightest inclination to leap before an approaching express train. I'm sure you never think of this.
Journey into Fear was the third of the three RKO pictures on his deal, so he obviously had to fulfill. And I think to some extent he was endeavouring to play by the rule. And above all, what must have been a blessed relief to everybody at RKO was that he wasn't going to direct it. It was given to a kind of journeyman director called Norman Foster, and he would just play one of the baddies, basically. It was Joseph Cotton would play the hero.
Wells has said on many occasions that, in fact, the people who directed it was the person nearest the camera. So I think it was probably a joint effort, just in order to get the thing in the bag. The real problem was that he had no final cut on it, and by the end of the film, in post-production, RKO fired him, so he was out.
He was furious. He didn't like the film terribly. He wasn't as furious as he was with Magnificent Amazons, which he knew was a classic, or was one of his classics. But Journey into Fear was the last straw.
Orson Welles was deemed too flat-footed to serve in the military during World War II, but he did want to support the troops, and since an early age he had been very into magic. So he took his magic show on tour for the troops, at one point working with Marlene Dietrich to saw her in half. And my goodness, what would this be worth today if we had a video of Orson and Marlene? Orson Welles had gotten divorced from his first wife and then married actress Rita Hayworth in 1943, and they were married for 5 years.
I think he loved this idea of himself as kind of the prince of Hollywood, or the prince of film, which would have really knocked the studio heads. This idea that he embodied in the way that they felt they did. So going to Cannes with Rita Hayworth and being shot by the paparazzi and having all the headlines saying the great Hollywood couple would have just put fuel on the fire of the distrust and dislike of him. And he would have known it.
Where'd he come from?
From Lowood Institution, sir.
Lowood? What's that?
It's a charity school. I was there 10 years.
10 years. You must be tenacious of life. No wonder you have rather the look of another world. I marveled where you got that sort of face. When you came on me in the mist, I found myself thinking of fairy tales. I'd have a mind to demand whether you'd bewitched my horse. Indeed, I'm not sure yet.
If his star had slightly fallen as a director, his star as an actor was very much in the ascendant, and he was the first choice to play Mr. Rochester in the film of Jane Eyre.
You wonder, with the likes of Jane Eyre, what other career there might have been where he took on harder roles, he tested his limits as an actor.
You have no faith in the reforms that are being effected in Germany?
Well, I don't know, Mr. Wilson. I can't believe that people can be reformed except from within. The basic principles of equality and freedom never have, never will take root in Germany. The will to freedom has been voiced in every other tongue. All men are created equal, liberté, égalité, fraternité, but in German...
There's Marx. Proletarians unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains.
But Marx wasn't a German, Marx was a Jew.
His third feature in 1946 was The Stranger. This stars Orson Welles alongside Edward G. Robinson and Loretta Young. It's the story of an investigator tracking down a Nazi fugitive in a small town. It's quite a complicated shoot, really, because Orson Welles had been keen to prove that he could direct on time, on budget, and in doing so, he sort of took the joy out of it for himself. There was not as much time to devote to the creativity of directing. So he later said this was one of his least favorite films that he had directed.
You killed him?
With these hands. The same hands that have held you close to me. Now are you satisfied to let me go?
Funnily enough, and ironically, The Stranger was a hit. It was a relatively cheap production. I think it's like $1.5 million at the time, and it made about $4 million. And while it's always written conveniently that Orson Welles never had a hit, he did, and it was The Stranger.
After 5 years of marriage, Orson Welles and Rita Hayworth's relationship had begun to break down. However, he still cast the actress in his 1947 film noir The Lady from Shanghai, another troubled production.
Could it be this you're looking for? You were smart to carry a gun, traveling alone in the park, but if you knew you had the gun in your bag, why throw away the bag?
I meant for you to find it. I don't know how to shoot.
It's easy. You just pull the trigger.
Wisely or unwisely, he starred with his own wife, Rita Hayworth, in The Lady from Shanghai. It's an incredibly complicated film. I've seen it several times and I still don't quite figure out what's going on a lot of the time. And she comes across very well in spite of the fact that he made her not only cut her wonderful red hair, but dye it blonde, which was sort of sacrilege. He wanted somebody else. He wanted another creature. He wanted a femme fatale who did not look like Gilda. He wanted a cross between Barbara Stanwyck and Kim Novak, and that's what he got.
I couldn't think where else we could meet. Only tourists come here and school children.
And lovers?
Oh, Michael.
Fair Rosalie.
You love me very much.
I do.
Do you still want to take me away with you?
Why do you ask me that?
Tell me where we'll go, Michael. Will you carry me off with you into the sunrise?
Stop tormenting me. I'll take proper care of you. You won't starve.
I don't care where it is, Michael. Just take me there. Take me quick. Take me.
It's seen now as a classic of film noir, but at the time it got pretty mixed reviews. The critics didn't love it. The public wasn't flocking out to see it. It's only in later years that people really praise its production design, the way it's edited. You know, something like the famous Hall of Mirrors shootout at the end of the film has really become one of those classic film noir moments.
I'm aiming at you, lover. Of course, killing you is killing myself. It's the same thing. But you know, I'm pretty tired of both of us.
The filming of that is peerless. I mean, to actually be able not only to conceive of that kind of sequence, but then to make it work is really something else. And there is no doubt that it has been hugely influential. Lots and lots of filmmakers since have tried to emulate that, and they've never quite got it right.
In 1947, Welles divorced from Rita Hayworth, with whom he had one daughter. The same year, he began a self-imposed exile from Hollywood, choosing to raise money for his films through independent channels.
What comes out of this struggle to deal with managerial figures and money men was the idea that he would minimize that kind of part of the political part of filmmaking. If he could minimize his budget and sort of reduce his filmmaking to a kind of pure expression of his genius, then he wouldn't be caught up with these other forces. And Macbeth, I think, was the first real attempt to fulfill that.
Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Thou marshals me the way that I was going. Art thou not fatal vision, as sensible to feeling as to sight, or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat oppressed brain?
Macbeth was something of a troubled production. Not so much troubled as rushed at the beginning. They tried to shoot Macbeth in 23 days, which pretty nigh on impossible. They were trying to shoot it on leftover sets of Westerns, which doesn't really make sense. And Orson Welles had wanted everybody to speak in a Scottish brogue on set. And when the film was first tested and released, audiences could not understand them. They realized this wasn't a good idea, so they went to re-record the voices without the Scottish accent. But still, not his finest hour, and I think he regretted the quick rush of the shoot.
Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red.
Macbeth is not the greatest Shakespeare film ever made, but it does have a lot of fascination about it. And I think what the most successful elements of it is its slightly surreal quality. This is borne out by the fact that he had one huge and very important fan for this film, and that was Jean Cocteau. Cocteau thought it was a brilliant film. In fact, he thought it was the best Shakespeare film he'd ever seen.
Good to see you, Harley.
Was that your funeral?
It was pretty smart, wasn't it? Oh, the same old indigestion, Holly. These are the only things that help, these tablets. These are the last. Can't get them anywhere in Europe anymore.
You know what's happened to your girl? She's been arrested.
Tough, very tough, but don't worry, old man. They won't hurt her.
You're handing her over to the Russians.
What can I do, old man? I'm dead, aren't I?
You can help somehow.
Holly. Exactly who did you tell about me,
I told the police.
Unwise, Holly.
And Anna?
Unwise.
One of his most famous films as an actor, rather than a producer or director, was in The Third Man, which was done by a British director, Carol Reed. It was made in post-war Vienna, and it had Joseph Cotten, who was a regular with Orson. It was a huge success, especially in England, pretty good in America too. But above all, he showed that he was an actor who could really make a difference to the film completely.
Although, of course, he is just an actor in it, playing Harry Lime, and he has very little screen time, actually, because he's supposedly dead. The character's supposedly dead throughout the film until he just emerges from the shadows. Wells brought something to that role that lifted an already great film into the realm of a masterpiece. And it wasn't just the fact that he brought the baggage of all his earlier roles, that brought the baggage of his persona into it. It was the very fact that he still had this slightly cherubic, seemingly innocent face. And yet when it emerged what he'd actually done as a criminal, as a black marketeer, which was so evil, was so incalculably difficult to understand. The shock of it is just wonderful. I mean, it is a real shock when you know what he's been doing.
Don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. Well, what the fella said. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Holly.
He didn't write that speech. He contributed to it. The famous cuckoo clock line, of course. But it is difficult to think of any other actor who could have pulled that off in the way that he does.
You know, in 10 minutes, Wells took what was an excellent thriller and I think turned them into a masterpiece.
Rude am I in my speech. Little blessed with the soft phrase of peace. For since these arms of mine had 7 years' pith, till now some 9 moons wasted, they've used their dearest action in the tented field. And little of this great world can I speak more than pertains to feats of broil and battle. And therefore little can I grace my cause in speaking for myself.
His next Shakespearean project was Othello. Wells himself would play Othello. This was a film that, for a variety of reasons, had terrible budgetary problems. He shot in Spain and Morocco. He kept running out of money. It took basically 3 years to make this film. But whenever he did run out of money, he'd have to leave to go and do an acting job or maybe a commercial or something to raise enough money to be able to then pay his actors and whatever.
He found that in order to have it properly distributed in America, at least, he had to cut it down from 3 hours to about 90 minutes, which is quite some cutting.
What have I said? I'd seen him do you wrong, or heard him say...
Have they said anything?
He hath, my lord, but no more than he...
What did he say?
Faith that he did. I know not what he...
What?
Lie.
Lie with her?
With her. On her. What you will.
It was this kind of feast of sort of spontaneity and raggedness. Like Macbeth, it's kind of all over the place, but in ways it's also genius and thrilling and exciting. And it's got that kind of fly by the seat of your pants thing that Orson Welles also has, that he was so sure of his talents that he could literally make it up as he went along.
In 1958, Welles was cast as a corrupt police chief on the Mexican border in a film called Badge of Evil, based on a pulp thriller. Charlton Heston was going to play the good guy. Heston, to his eternal credit, only agreed to do the film if Welles would direct it. The result of this collaboration was that Welles took what might have been a good, but, late pulp noir and turned it into a Baroque masterpiece. Apart from anything else, it contains the longest opening tracking shot in cinema history, certainly up to that point.
What are you scared of, partner? That stuff isn't nearly as easy to blow up as people seem to think. It doesn't go off quite that easy.
You found the dynamite in this box?
Dynamite? Yeah. Pete found it. Told you that.
Captain.
Yeah?
I looked in that box. Just now, there wasn't anything there.
I know how you feel.
Do you?
Sure I do. You people are touchy. It's only human you'd want to come to the defense of your fellow countrymen.
It was one of the last of the film noirs, really, and one of the greatest, too. Also in the film, of course, one of her best parts was Janet Leigh, who her agent said, "Oh, no, you don't want to go into that. There's no money in it." And she was absolutely furious when Orson wrote to her and said, "I'm afraid your agent's turned you down." And she wrote back and said to the agent and said, "I don't care if I have to pay to be in a film with Orson Welles directing, and I want to be in this film." And it is one of her greatest performances.
You know what's wrong with you, Mr. Grandy? You've been seeing too many gangster movies. Mike may be spoiling some of your fun.
Mike?
My husband, yeah. And if you're trying to scare me into calling him off, let me tell you something, Mr. Grandy. I may be scared, but he won't be.
He had problems with, as always, with the studios who edited it in a way that he didn't care for. And he wrote, legendarily, a 58-page memo explaining why he did what he did and why, and asking him to restore everything. Eventually, somewhere in the 70s, I think it was, they discovered an earlier version of the film, which was closer to Welles's original, which was restored and brought out. There's a subsequent restoration, the latest one, which actually used the notes that he wrote.
You are Arnie?
Yes.
Judd?
Yes, sir.
Your folks have retained me as counsel for the defense.
I've always admired you tremendously, Mr.
You
Willard.
can prove it, both of you, by saying absolutely nothing to anybody until I instruct you to the contrary.
By this time, any film with Orson Welles in it, he tended to get top billing. And he did so in compulsion, though in fact you had to wait half the film before you even saw him in it.
It was based on an infamous real-life murder case in which two boys, young men, killed someone for kicks. The heart of the film is the trial, in which the defender is played by Orson Welles, Julian Wilkes. He brings to this role a gravitas and a humanity that is very rarely seen.
Do I need to argue with Your Honor that cruelty only breeds cruelty? That every religious leader who's held up as an example has taught us that if there's any way to kill evil, it's not by killing men. And if there's any way of destroying hatred and all that goes with it, it's not through evil and hatred and cruelty. It's through charity, love, understanding.
Wells's presence and that particular scene sends it into the stratosphere. It's something else. It's really compelling stuff.
Does that mean that you're actually connected with the court?
With whom else should I associate? Not with men of my own profession.
That's certainly incontrovertible.
I'm handicapped these days by illness. But good friends from the law court still visit me here from time to time. I manage to fix with them. For instance, there's a dear friend of mine visiting me at this very moment.
In 1962, Orson Welles comes to Europe to shoot The Trial, adapted from the Franz Kafka famous story. He shoots the film in France and in then Yugoslavia. It's a very intense work, as befitting with the source material, but it's really praised for the set design, the cinematography, the camera angles he's choosing.
It's shot with all of that glorious, sort of gloomy yet beautiful sort of Citizen Kanean black and white photography, but in a slightly more sort of modern feel to it.
There was an amazing scene. He actually shot, because he couldn't find a place big enough, he shot in the then abandoned Gare d'Orsay, and he hired something like 800 Olivetti typewriters, so that when Kay arrives in this office, there's nothing but the endless clatter of secretaries. I mean, hugely nightmarish. Very, very influential film, especially on Terry Gilliam, whose Brazil owes a great debt to this film.
Points, but for sweet Jack Falstaff, kind Jack Falstaff, true Jack Falstaff, valiant Jack Falstaff, and therefore more valiant, being as he is old Jack Falstaff. Banish not him, thy hair is company, banish not him, thy hair is company, banish plump Jack and banish all the world.
I do!
Chimes at Midnight is the greatest Shakespearean film ever made. I have absolutely no problem with saying that. It contains all the elements of what Welles wanted to do with Falstaff, a figure that he's closely identified with for years, and he'd always wanted to play. He'd written a series of plays with that central character. I think there were like 5 plays or something like that, and he took them from all of Shakespeare's works and sort of put them together into one whole. Nobody has ever got anywhere near getting Shakespeare on the screen in the same way as he did with this film.
That's a remarkable film. He said it was one of the best things he ever made. Rather like Othello, it had some amazing scenes in it. The performance was outstanding, and people admired it greatly.
I would to a bedtime, Hal, and all well.
Why, thou owest God a debt.
'Tis not due yet. I'll be loath to pay him before his day. What need I be so forward with him that calls not on me? Well, no matter. Honor pricks me.
It's a beautiful exploration both of a character, of a playwright, of a director expressing himself, of reminding us of his talent, and of, just what you can do with the medium.
You force it out of me. That you and your most dearly loved are wrapped together in a hideous sin. Blind to the horror of it. You, Oedipus, you yourself, murdered the man whose murderer you seek.
Partly because of his love of the classics. He was offered the role of Tiresias, the blind prophet, in Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King. Philip Saville's production which he shot, rather interestingly, in the theatre di Donato in Greece, on the amphitheatre. The great thing about it is, Wells, who might have easily just dominated the thing, he performs really subtly. The whole sequence on the steps when he delivers the prophecy to what Oedipus's fate is going to be, which is genuinely terrifying. He plays down, not up. And it's just wonderful. It works.
You see and still are blind. Appallingly. Blind to your origins. Blind to a union in your house.
It's a great scene, and I think that he probably enjoyed doing it. And I'm sorry that the film isn't better known, because it should be seen.
Into the 1970s, Orson Welles continued to be a large presence in popular culture, acting on film and making numerous appearances on television talk shows.
I have a terrible feeling that because I'm speaking to you from the back of the theater, and because I have a white beard, you may expect me to give you the truth about something. I'm speaking from the cheap seats, not from Mount Sinai. I think your question is very interesting and apt insofar as it has to do with the collapse of the family, the clan, the collapse of the community sense, and then the clan, and then the family.
Henry Jaglom's Someone to Love sees Orson Welles in his final on-screen performance. It's not his biggest film or his greatest film, but it is quite a nice footnote to his career, especially because he's playing a filmmaker within the pseudo-documentary that's in this film.
Someone to Love became a posthumous release when Orson Welles unexpectedly passed away in 1985.
Welles, having appeared on the Merv Griffin show in 1985 to do what was to be his last interview, 2 hours later had a massive heart attack and died.
Orson Welles was 70 years old when he died of a heart attack, October 10th, 1985, in Hollywood.
You know, Mr. Thatcher, at the rate of $1 million a year, I'll have to close this place in 60 years.
Wells's legacy is so huge, it's really hard to get your head around. Here is a man who not only left us a fistful of masterpieces, but we must also regret that he wasn't allowed to do more. I think it is to the eternal shame of Hollywood that they curtailed this genius.
You hang these boys, it will mean that in this land of ours, a court of law could not help but bow down to public opinion.
His legacy is that he was a genius, and he was a man who could do anything to do with film. When you look at his career, you think what it could have been. But if you actually look at it again, my goodness, it was extraordinary.
No other filmmaker transformed the medium as well as he did. He is, I suppose, not to sound too grand, one of the gods of the medium. And, you know, in its infancy, he's its kind of Zeus.
It's been described as a literary lover's dream. Join Sky Arts for live coverage and highlights from the Cheltenham Literature Festival 2019 from 7 every night next week, starting Monday on Sky Arts.